Most Americans had never heard of Kharg Island until this war. That is exactly what makes it dangerous. The most explosive places in the world are often not the capitals, not the famous battlefields, not the names printed on campaign slogans, but the hidden choke points where money, power, and fear are fused together. And when one of those places is touched, the shock does not stay local. It moves through oil, through markets, through governments, and eventually into your wallet. Before we go further, subscribe to the channel and support the work. That support is what keeps this analysis sharp, independent, and coming. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. Kharg Island looks small on a map. That is the first deception. In politics, the places that matter most are often the ones that appear least impressive from a distance. Kharg is not a global city. It is not a cultural capital. It is not a place loaded with symbolism for ordinary Americans. But in hard power terms, it is one of the most important pieces of land in the Middle East, because this tiny island is not valuable for what it is. It is valuable for what flows through it. Roughly 90% of Iran's crude exports move through Kharg Island. That number is not a detail. That number is the story. It means Kharg is not just another terminal. It is the export heart of the Iranian state. The island is where pipelines from major oil fields feed into storage, loading, and tanker operations that convert underground resources into national survival. Strip away the rhetoric, strip away the ideology, strip away the military pageantry, and the reality is brutally simple: oil is the revenue engine, and Kharg is the nozzle. That makes Kharg Island more than infrastructure. It makes it a control point in the struggle over who gets to breathe economically in this war. This is where Americans need to see the deeper structure. Iran is not just defending territory. It is defending cash flow, state continuity, and bargaining power. Oil revenue is what gives Tehran room to absorb sanctions, finance government operations, sustain regional influence, and project defiance under pressure. When the United States bombed military targets on Kharg but spared the oil infrastructure, that was not a random tactical choice. That was Washington sending a message with surgical clarity: we know where your lifeline is, we can touch it, and next time we may not stop short. That is why this story is bigger than a single strike. Kharg Island now sits at the intersection of military coercion and economic blackmail. The U.S. is trying to use force without detonating the full financial consequences of force. Iran is trying to preserve its economic artery while warning that if its lifeline is severed, the wider regional energy system will burn with it. This is not just battlefield logic. This is pressure politics at the highest level. And here is the deeper danger: Kharg is not only important to Iran. It matters to the entire global oil system. In economics, there are certain nodes so central that once they are destabilized, the effect spreads fast and far. Kharg is one of those nodes. It concentrates too much export capacity in one place. In normal times, that creates efficiency. In wartime, it creates a single point of failure with global consequences. The same structure that made Iran's oil machine powerful also made it fragile. That fragility matters to every American household, whether people realize it or not. Because once a place like Kharg enters the target set, this stops being a distant foreign policy story. It becomes an inflation story. A gas price story. A supply chain story. A consumer confidence story. A retirement account story. The path from a missile strike in the Persian Gulf to a kitchen table in Ohio is shorter than most people think. Oil is not just a commodity. It is the bloodstream of industrial life. When fear enters that bloodstream, the whole body reacts. And this is why Kharg Island may define the next phase of the war. Not because it is dramatic in appearance, but because it exposes the central contradiction on both sides. For Donald Trump, Kharg is the perfect threat and the worst target. Hitting it harder could cripple Iran, but it could also send energy markets into panic and put economic pain back into American politics. For Iran, Kharg is both strength and weakness, the source of vital income, and the place where the country is most dangerously exposed. So when people ask why this island matters, the answer is simple. Kharg Island is where war meets money, where military escalation meets market fear, and where regional conflict threatens to become global economic stress. Small island, massive consequence. And if this war keeps climbing, Kharg may be remembered not just as a target, but as the hinge on which the entire crisis turned. Trump spared the oil, for now. That was not mercy. It was strategy under constraint. When Donald Trump chose to strike military targets on Kharg Island but leave its oil infrastructure standing, many people rushed to frame that decision as restraint. That is too soft a word for what actually happened. This was not mercy. It was not hesitation. It was not a sudden burst of humanitarian caution. It was power operating inside a cage of consequences. That distinction matters, because it tells us what kind of war this is becoming. Trump wanted to send several messages at once. To Iran, the message was blunt: the United States can reach one of the most sensitive points in your national system and hit it at will. To the Gulf states, the message was reassuring on the surface: Washington is still willing to act, still willing to escalate, still willing to put military weight behind its warnings. And to the American public, the message was carefully designed to project strength without immediately triggering the kind of economic backlash that can turn foreign policy swagger into domestic political pain. That is the real key here. Trump did not spare the oil because oil was off limits in principle. He spared it because destroying it would have collapsed the space between military success and economic self-harm. This is where many political debates in Washington become unserious. Too many people still talk about force as if it exists in a vacuum, as if a missile strike is only a military event. It is not. In a place like Kharg Island, force is economic policy by other means. The target sits inside a living system of oil flows, shipping confidence, insurance pricing, and market psychology. Once you understand that, Trump's decision becomes easier to read. He was not stepping back from escalation. He was trying to control the price tag of escalation. And that price tag matters more than any speech. American voters do not experience war the way strategists do. They do not sit inside war rooms studying maps of the Persian Gulf. They feel power through cost. They feel it when gasoline rises. They feel it when airline tickets climb, shipping slows, groceries inch up, and markets begin to wobble. That is where presidential bravado runs into political gravity. You can dominate a news cycle with the language of strength. You cannot dominate a grocery bill. Trump knows this better than many of his critics admit. He understands that inflation is not a background issue in the United States. It is one of the most politically dangerous forces in American life. It dissolves patience. It punishes incumbents. It cuts across ideology. A voter who can tolerate aggressive rhetoric abroad often becomes much less patient when foreign escalation starts showing up in monthly expenses at home. That is why Kharg's oil network remains the line he has threatened, but not yet crossed. In political economy, this is what constraint looks like. A president may command aircraft carriers, bombers, intelligence networks, and the most powerful military on Earth. But he is still constrained by bond markets, consumer sentiment, fuel costs, and electoral math. That is not weakness. That is reality. Power in the modern era is never just about what you can hit. It is about what you can hit without breaking the system that keeps your own position stable. Trump is now operating inside that contradiction. He wants Iran to believe that nothing is safe. He wants the threat to feel total. But he also needs to avoid the scenario in which his own escalation detonates the very forces that weaken him politically. If Kharg's oil infrastructure is destroyed, the immediate headline might look like dominance. The longer aftermath could look very different: oil spikes, inflation pressure, financial anxiety, and a furious debate at home over whether this war is serving American interests or wrecking them. That is why the strike on military assets mattered so much symbolically. It created a zone of fear without yet unleashing the full shock. It told Tehran that its economic lifeline now lives under direct American shadow. But it also told traders, consumers, and allies that the most destabilizing option is still sitting on the table. In that sense, even Trump's restraint is destabilizing. Markets do not relax just because a line has not been crossed. They react to the fact that the line is visible, reachable, and politically live. There is another layer here that deserves more attention. Trump also has to think about the story he is telling about the purpose of this war. If the United States claims it is targeting Iranian power while keeping broader stability intact, then smashing the core of Iran's oil economy would expose the contradiction at the center of that claim. It would show that Washington is prepared not just to punish the regime, but to inflict long-term economic devastation on the country itself. That would not look like precision. It would look like systemic ruin. So yes, Donald Trump spared the oil. But he spared it under pressure, under calculation, and under the shadow of consequences he cannot fully control. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. The most destructive option has not been rejected. It has been postponed. And in wars shaped by ego, leverage, and economic fragility, postponement is not peace. It is merely the narrow ledge before the next decision. Tehran's retaliation doctrine is now out in the open. Tehran's retaliation doctrine is now out in the open. What Iran has done since the bombing of Kharg Island is not just react. It has clarified. It has stripped away the diplomatic fog and stated, in hard strategic language, how it intends to answer pressure from the United States. And that answer is chilling in its logic. Tehran is saying that if its own economic lifeline is pushed closer to collapse, it will not keep the consequences contained inside Iran. It will spread them outward, across the Gulf, across allied infrastructure, across the energy system itself. That is the real meaning of Iran's warning. Too often, American audiences hear statements like these and dismiss them as theater. That is a mistake. Iran is not speaking here in the language of pure emotion. It is speaking in the language of cost imposition. It understands that it cannot defeat the United States in a conventional military contest. It knows Donald Trump can threaten harder, strike faster, and escalate with far greater firepower. But Tehran also knows something just as important: in a tightly connected energy region, you do not need to overpower your enemy to hurt him. You only need to make the system around him unstable enough, expensive enough, and dangerous enough that his advantages begin to carry a price. That is what this doctrine is designed to do. At its core, Iran's message is brutally simple. If the United States turns the war into an attack on Iran's economic survival, then Iran will turn the war into an attack on the economic architecture surrounding American power. Not just bases. Not just ships. Not just military facilities. The wider structure. Ports, docks, loading hubs, energy assets, shipping lanes, and the regional nodes that allow Gulf oil and commerce to function. Tehran is saying, if you come for our oxygen, we will poison the air around yours. That is not the language of a state preparing to surrender. It is the language of a state preparing to widen the map of pain. And the reason this matters is that Iran has chosen a doctrine built not on battlefield symmetry, but on systemic vulnerability. This is where many US politicians still think too narrowly. They talk as if military superiority automatically guarantees strategic control. It does not. Not in a war like this. In the Gulf, the battlefield is not only made of runways, radar sites, and missile launchers. It is made of interdependence. The same region that supplies energy, hosts American partnerships, and underpins global confidence is also full of exposed arteries. Iran cannot outbuild the United States. But it can threaten those arteries. This is a form of modern coercion that Americans need to understand clearly. Iran is weaponizing the fact that the global economy depends on concentration. Too much oil, too much shipping, too much strategic value moves through too few places. That creates efficiency in times of peace. In times of conflict, it creates leverage for a weaker actor willing to take risks. Tehran's doctrine is built on that truth. It is telling the United States and its allies that the Gulf will not remain a protected platform for pressure if Iran's own foundations are directly attacked. That is why the warning extends far beyond Iran itself. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, these are not side characters in this story. They are part of the live structure around American power. They host assets, routes, commercial corridors, and symbols of regional order. If Iran strikes at US-linked energy and economic infrastructure, it is not just retaliating. It is trying to alter the psychology of the region. It wants every government, every port operator, every energy company, every shipping insurer, and every foreign investor to start asking the same question: is the American security umbrella still reducing risk, or is it now attracting it? That question is deadly because once it takes hold, Iran has already scored a strategic point. You do not need to destroy every facility you threaten. You only need to make people fear disruption enough that they begin to change behavior on their own. Delayed shipments. Suspended operations. Defensive repositioning. Capital hesitating at the edge. Governments forced into public reassurance. This is how a weaker state can expand the costs of war without matching the raw force of its opponent. It fights by shaking confidence in the system itself. There is also a deeper emotional force beneath Tehran's position. Iran is signaling that it will not accept a future in which its economy is strangled while the surrounding region continues to function normally. That is not only a military warning. It is a political declaration of endurance through escalation. It tells domestic audiences that Iran will not absorb punishment quietly. It tells regional audiences that neutrality may become impossible. And it tells Washington that every move against Iran's core economic structure risks turning a campaign of pressure into a much wider regional stress event. That is why the doctrine matters so much now. The bombing of Kharg Island did not just raise the temperature. It clarified the stakes. Donald Trump is signaling that America can move closer to Iran's economic heart. Tehran is signaling that if America crosses that line, the answer will not stay confined to one island, one terminal, or one state. The answer will move through the network. And that is the point American viewers should hold on to. This is no longer just about what can be hit. It is about what can be made unstable. Iran's retaliation doctrine is now out in the open because Tehran wants the whole region, and the American public, to understand one thing before the next decision is made: if this war shifts from military punishment to economic suffocation, the Gulf may stop behaving like an energy system and start behaving like a battlefield. The front line is no longer where maps say it is. One of the oldest mistakes in war is believing that the battlefield stays where generals draw it. That illusion has now collapsed. This conflict is no longer contained inside Iran, or inside Israel, or inside the narrow military logic of airstrikes and retaliation. The front line has moved into cities built on confidence, ports built on continuity, and countries that once believed they could stand close to the fire without being burned by it. That is the real meaning of what we are watching now. The war is no longer only about territory. It is about exposure. Look at Dubai. For years, Dubai sold the world a promise. This was the place in the Middle East where business could continue, luxury could expand, and instability could be kept outside the glass walls of wealth. That image was not an accident. It was carefully built by money, architecture, branding, and political control. Influencers amplified it. Investors trusted it. Expats relocated around it. Global capital rewarded it. Dubai was marketed not simply as a city, but as an exception to the region around it. That exception is now under direct pressure. When debris from an intercepted projectile strikes a building in a financial district, the physical damage matters. But the larger damage is psychological. A place like Dubai does not live on concrete alone. It lives on confidence. It lives on the assumption that people with money, talent, and global mobility can plant themselves there without waking up inside a war zone. Once that assumption cracks, even slightly, the consequences begin moving through the entire model. Tourism feels it. Finance feels it. Real estate feels it. International hiring feels it. Insurance feels it. The city may still function, but the myth of untouchability is gone. And once that myth is gone, the cost is not measured only in repairs. It is measured in hesitation. That is why the events in the United Arab Emirates matter so much. Iran does not need to devastate Dubai to change its strategic value. It only needs to prove that Dubai is no longer safely outside the radius of escalation. In modern power politics, that kind of proof can be enough to change behavior. A missile does not have to land cleanly to leave a mark. Fear travels faster than shrapnel. Then there is Fujairah, and this is where the story becomes even more serious. Fujairah is not famous in the American imagination. But strategically, it matters because it sits outside the Strait of Hormuz and has long served as one of the region's most important fallback points for oil loading and bunkering. In simple terms, it is part of the contingency architecture, the practical answer to the question of how Gulf energy can keep moving when Hormuz becomes dangerous. So when operations there are disrupted after a drone attack and fire, the message is unmistakable. The backup system is not immune. The pressure is no longer confined to the choke point itself. It is spreading to the alternatives. That should alarm every serious planner in Washington. Because once both the primary route and the secondary nodes begin to feel vulnerable, the conflict stops looking like a localized crisis and starts looking like a systems problem. This is not only about who controls a strait or who strikes an island. It is about whether the wider regional network can still function under sustained pressure. That is a much bigger question, and a much more dangerous one. Baghdad reveals another side of the same reality. When US-linked diplomatic or security sites come under attack in Iraq, the war is telling us something important. American power in the region is not just a source of deterrence. It is also a target set. The United States has spent decades building a regional posture meant to project strength, reassure partners, and contain threats. But in a war like this, that same posture creates a scattered field of exposure. Bases, embassies, compounds, supply corridors, all of them become pressure points. The larger the footprint, the wider the attack surface. Lebanon deepens the picture. Hezbollah means that Iran does not fight only from within its own borders. It fights through layers, through partners, through fronts that can heat up when needed. That creates strategic depth for Tehran and strategic exhaustion for everyone else. Lebanon becomes both a battlefield and a warning. This war can move laterally, not just vertically. It can spread sideways through networks of alliance and militia power, opening new fronts without formal declarations. This is why the old map is no longer enough. The real battlefield now is not a line. It is a web. Dubai, Fujairah, Baghdad, Lebanon, these are not separate episodes. They are connected stress points inside one regional system. Oil flows connect them. Shipping risk connects them. Military alliances connect them. Financial confidence connects them. Public fear connects them. And that is what makes this moment so volatile. Once war enters the spaces where energy, capital, logistics, and identity all overlap, it becomes harder to contain and easier to misjudge. What looks like one more strike can become a credibility crisis. What looks like one more interception can become an economic warning. What looks like one more regional incident can become the signal that the front line has already moved past the map. And once that happens, distance becomes a political illusion. The war may still be centered in the Middle East. But the consequences are no longer staying there. The next strike could hit more than Iran, it could hit the logic of the entire war. The most dangerous point in a war is not always the first explosion. Sometimes it is the moment when both sides start believing they can still control the consequences of the next one. That is where this conflict is now. The next strike may land on a military site, a shipping route, a port, a US-linked facility, or somewhere inside the wider energy chain. But wherever it lands, the real target may be something even bigger, the fragile idea that this war can keep escalating without breaking the system around it. That idea is becoming harder to defend by the day. Donald Trump is trying to project a very specific kind of power. He wants Iran to feel constant pressure, permanent vulnerability, and the fear of a larger strike still to come. At the same time, he wants the United States to look decisive without triggering a shock so severe that it starts punishing American households, rattling markets, and turning strategic force into political self-damage. That balancing act is not impossible. But it is becoming thinner, riskier, and less believable. Iran, for its part, is playing a different but equally dangerous game. Tehran knows it cannot overpower the United States in raw military terms. So it is trying to prove something else, that it can make victory expensive, make escalation messy, and make every American move carry secondary costs far beyond the initial target. That is the heart of its posture now. Not clean battlefield triumph, but strategic contamination. Not dominance, but disruption. And when both sides begin operating on those terms, wars stop behaving like campaigns and start behaving like systems failures. There are, in my view, three broad paths ahead. The first is prolonged controlled escalation. This is the scenario in which the United States keeps pressuring Iran militarily while avoiding a direct strike on the core oil infrastructure of Kharg Island. Donald Trump continues using threat as leverage, naval escorts expand around the Strait of Hormuz, and Tehran responds through pressure, intimidation, and selective disruption rather than a full attack on the regional energy web. This path is not peace. It is a suspended crisis. The markets stay tense. Oil stays politically charged. The Gulf remains one misstep away from a much larger rupture. This is the most likely short-term path, but also the one most vulnerable to error, ego, and accident. The second path is energy escalation. This is the true redline scenario. If Kharg Island's oil network is hit directly, or if Tehran concludes that such a move is imminent, then the war changes character. It is no longer just about coercion or deterrence. It becomes a contest over whether the energy architecture of the Gulf can survive sustained attack. That is when the region's ports, terminals, shipping corridors, and strategic infrastructure become more than symbols. They become operational targets in a cascading economic war. At that point, oil prices do not merely rise. They become instruments of political panic. Inflation does not merely worsen. It becomes a strategic aftershock. And the United States does not simply face a foreign crisis. It faces a domestic political one. The third path is regional rupture. This is the scenario few leaders want to describe openly because once named clearly, it becomes much harder to pretend the war is still limited. More strikes on US-linked sites. More attacks across the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Iraq, or Lebanon. More military deployments. More proxy activation. More pressure on shipping. More pressure on governments already trying to reassure frightened populations and nervous investors. This is the path where the war stops looking like a managed confrontation and starts looking like a regional unraveling. What makes all three scenarios so dangerous is that none of them depends on a grand decision alone. They depend on accumulation, repetition, misreading, escalation under stress. That is how strategic control is lost in real time. Not always through one spectacular failure, but through a chain of moves that each side tells itself it can still manage. That is why Americans should be asking the hardest question now: what is the actual end state Washington is aiming for? Bombing is not a strategy. Threats are not a strategy. Escorting tankers is not a strategy. Moving Marines and warships is not a strategy. These are instruments. Useful ones, sometimes necessary ones. But without a clear and believable political destination, instruments of pressure can slowly become instruments of drift. And drift is deadly in a war tied so tightly to energy, inflation, and public trust. The deeper problem is that this conflict now operates on two battlefields at once. The visible battlefield is made of missiles, aircraft, runways, ports, and military targets. The invisible battlefield is made of expectations. Oil expectations. Inflation expectations. Market expectations. Allied expectations. Voter expectations. Once the invisible battlefield starts slipping, leaders can find themselves winning tactical exchanges while losing strategic stability. That is one of the oldest traps in modern power politics, confusing the ability to strike with the ability to shape the future. Kharg Island sits at the center of that danger. Not because it is the only important site in this war, but because it is where military pressure, financial vulnerability, and systemic risk now collide most clearly. If Donald Trump crosses the line he has threatened, or if Tehran decides the line has already been crossed in substance, then the next phase of this war will not be measured only in damage assessments and military briefings. It will be measured in price shocks, shaken alliances, rising fear, and a wider collapse of confidence. That is the real warning of this moment. The next strike may hit Iran. But the bigger danger is that it could hit the logic holding this conflict together, the dangerous illusion that escalation can continue without everything around it beginning to crack. In the end, this story is not just about Donald Trump, Iran, or Kharg Island. It is about what happens when power, money, and pride collide at the same time. We watched a small island become a pressure point for the global economy. We watched Washington try to project strength without triggering economic pain at home. We watched Tehran make clear that if its lifeline is threatened, the wider regional system will pay the price. And we watched the illusion of a limited conflict begin to crack under the weight of oil, shipping, fear, and political calculation. What makes this story so important is that every side is operating inside a dangerous contradiction. Donald Trump wants escalation without owning the inflation that may follow. Iran wants survival without surrender, and is willing to spread risk across the Gulf to prove it. The wider region wants stability, but is being pulled into a war that no longer respects maps, borders, or old assumptions. That is the deeper lesson. In modern politics, the most dangerous crises are not always the loudest ones at first. They are the ones hidden inside systems people depend on every day: energy, trade, prices, trust, and public confidence. And there is a life lesson here for all of us. Never judge stability only by appearances. A system can look strong on the surface and still be dangerously fragile underneath. That applies to nations, businesses, families, and even our personal lives. If we want real resilience, we cannot build everything on one pressure point. We need margin, discipline, clear thinking, and the courage to face reality before a crisis forces it on us. Now here's a quick question for you. Which matters more in this conflict right now? A. Military power. B. Economic pressure. Comment A or B below. And I want to hear your view too. Do you think this war can still be contained, or has the wider system already started to break? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can learn from different perspectives. And if you value this kind of sharp, serious analysis, subscribe to the channel and support the work. That support helps keep these videos coming.